all we've talked about so far are hooks, right? How to do state with hooks. How to just use what are used to be called stateless functional components, and now people just call them function components. But if you see that terminology, those mean the same thing, right? It just means a function that's not a class. I'm going to show you how to do the other way of doing components, which are class components. And they function in most ways very similarly, and in other ways a bit differently. So we're going to make the details page be a class component. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say class details extends react.component. Okay? So this is a JavaScript class. There's nothing special about this yet, right? It extends React component, which means that it has some inheritance that it's going to get from a React component. But other than that, it works relatively the same way. The one hard requirement of every class component is it must have a render method. It will not work unless you have a render method. And then this render method works mostly like how a function component works, right? So one thing to keep in mind as well is that you can't use hooks with classes, right? So useState just will simply not function inside of a class component. Okay. So we're going to put in a render method here in just a second. But let's go ahead and put in a component did mount. So component, you can see here that it's actually going to try and complete it for me because it knows it's coming from React component. That's how it knows all of these methods. These are called lifecycle methods. And today we're going to talk about component did mount. And component did mount is very, very similar to useEffect in the sense that it runs when it first starts up, but then it stops. It doesn't run anymore after that, okay? Whereas useEffect, you have to give it the dependencies and things like that. Component did mount just says, like, I'm going to do this once when I first get created, and then I'm done doing this thing, okay? So that's what we're going to do with component did mount. Component did mount is useful for things like doing AJAX requests, which is exactly what we're going to do, right? When someone loads the page, we want to go to the API and get the pet information back from the API, right? So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to say pet, which we're going to import that from import pet from frontend masters /pet. And we're going to say pet dot animal, so single animal. And then we're going to pass it, we want to pass it the ID that we're getting from here, right? Like from /details/1, right? We want to pass it this number 1 right there, right? That ID that we're getting from the URL. So the way we're going to do that is with this dot props dot ID. So rather than getting that in as an argument like we were with functions, it comes on this dot props. And you can be assured that anything that's passed in from the parents is going to come in from this dot props. The one thing to keep in mind with this dot props is it's immutable. You can't change it. So a child receives props from its parents, and it can't change them. It can only read them, right? They're read only in that sense. Does that make sense? Okay, and then after that, this is a promise, so I'm going to say dot then. And we're going to get the animal back from the API. There's an arrow function here. And we're going to say this dot set state. And we're going to get the name is going to be animal.name. Just if you put like a return here, it'll just stop giving you all the red lines. We'll fix that in a second. I'm just getting sick of the red lines. Name, animal.name. We'll do animal is animal.type. here we'll do location, which will be a template string, because we have to put a couple things together here. We're going to do animal.contact.address.city space, comma, animal.contact.address.state. Description will be animal.description, and media will be animal.photos, and breed will be animal.breeds.primary. And then the other thing that we're going to do here is we're going to say loading false. So we're going to say loading false. So when we first load the page, we're going to put it into a loading state, right? Because you're grabbing something from the API, right? And then whenever this comes back from the API, we're going to set that to be loading false. Now the way that we're going to set it to be a loading state is we're going to say constructor up here. Let's say constructor, and constructor will take in the props, and you have to say super props. This is just something kind of, it's an odd ritual that you just have to do. That it's going to be constructed with properties, and you have to hand those properties up to React, right? So that's what this does. This super prop says, hey, call the constructor on my parent class, which is a React component. Does that make sense? If you don't do this, React will yell at you, so just get used to doing it. Okay, here I'm going to set an initial state, so I'm going to say this.state equals loading, true. So let's talk about this.state versus this.props. This.props is information that you get from your parent class that's handed down to you, right? This is, again, what was coming in via parameters before. Now, we don't have hooks, so we don't have any way to keep stateful things using hooks, right? So the way that we do that with class components is using this.state. Whereas this.props is immutable and only comes from the parent, this.state is self-contained within the class, so no other components can modify its state. It's master of its own state, right? So in this particular case, I'm instantiating, right? Like I'm creating the first set of state, but everything after that I'll do with this .set state, right? So after I call this .set state here, this will update this state up here, right? So this will get a bunch of new state from all this stuff, right? And then this loading true will be set to loading false. Make sense? Okay? So the thing to know about when I call this .set state, this is what's called a shallow merge, right? So it basically, I mean, it might even literally, it just says object, you can ignore this, but just showing you what it does. Object assign old state, new state, right? So that basically what that means, if any of these collide, like this one does with this one, it'll overwrite this one, right? But everything else, it'll just be additive. So if this had some other thing, this would not get overwritten. This would still exist afterwards, right? But it is shallow, right? So if I have like deeply nested objects, those will get overwritten, right? So it just does the top level. And that's how you do state with class components. This is how we've been doing state for a really long time until hooks came along. Something else I want to call out here. Notice I used an arrow function here instead of saying function here. You've probably noticed that I use a lot of arrow functions just by the nature of how I code. In this case, it's actually required. Do I want to say required? It's very difficult if you don't do it this way. So why? Why is this a problem here? Well, if I put a function here, what is this? The answer is not what you want it to be. I don't actually know what it's going to be, but it's not going to be what you want it to be, right? when I put function here, it creates a new context when this is invoked. This dot then is going to be invoked somewhere else. That might be window, it might be the promise itself. I'm not actually sure what it gets invoked on. But if I do an arrow function instead, it will not create a new context, which is what arrow functions do. They don't create new contexts, right? So this will be correct. That makes sense? So with class components, what this is very important, right? It's actually one of the reasons why they chose to go the direction of hooks is because this is kind of hard to teach, right? It can be. There's just like a handful of things that you need to be aware of, and I think after that it's pretty easy to move past what this is. And you can also put here in the then, you can just put console.error. So if there's any errors from the APIs, it'll just log it out to the console. You should have better error handling than this, right? You should report it to your service and show the error some useful error message. This is not a course on error handling. They have a course on that. You should watch that.